When General Beauharnais left the Army of the Rhine, he had retired to one of his estates, situated a few leagues from Blois. There he lived in profound retirement, lamenting the deplorable outrages that disgraced liberty, and bitterly regretting the glory he could no longer share. But his name had been too celebrated for him to entertain a reasonable hope of escaping the persecutions to which the members of the Constituent Assembly were exposed. He was arrested and thrown into the prisons of Paris shortly before the 9th of Thermidor, and at a time when the people were at last returning to right feeling and beginning to shudder at the sight of the blood with which they had long feasted their eyes. The Jacobins invented the prison conspiracies as a pretense for prolonging their measures. They had mixed with the prisoners some spies who found men vile enough to purchase their lives by atrocious calumny. One of these wretches, enraged at having been discovered by Monsieur de Beauharnais in the midst of his infamous intrigues, and at hearing him speak openly of the fact with all the honorable pride of an upright man, denounced him. He was sent to the scaffold and suffered on the 7th of Thermidor, 2 days before the fall of Robespierre. Madame de Beauharnais had been locked up during the 18 months in one of the prisons of Paris, where she had fallen seriously ill with her indictment, which was no better than a sentence of death, was transmitted to her. Fortunately, a Polish physician, an honest and courageous man, whose name I am sorry I do not know, attended her. He declared that she would not survive 8 days longer, and by that means saved her life. When she came out of prison, she exerted with resolute benevolence all the advantages which her name, her misfortune, and the gifts of her amiable mind conferred on her to obtain the liberty of the greatest part of her former companions in captivity. She was beloved and esteemed by the most respectable members of society. The excellent qualities of her heart made her fully worthy of her exalted station. I shall more than once recur with pleasure to her in the course of these memoirs. The functions of the commander-in-chief of the city of Paris gave considerable influence to General Bonaparte, and his conduct on the 13th Vendémiaire ensured him a just title to the confidence of the Directory. But government soon felt itself troubled and even humbled by the authority of the young general. To say the truth, he continually acted after his own way, meddled with everything, decided on everything, and never acted but upon his own ideas. The activity and extent of his mind and the pride of his nature rendered him unable to obey in any circumstances. The Directory wished still to spare the Jacobins. The general locked up their assembly room, and government learnt the step he had taken just when they were going to deliberate upon it. Some members of the old nobility seemed dangerous in Paris. The Directory resolved to send them away. The general extended to them his protection, and government was forced to yield. He prescribed measures, recalled disgraced generals, repelled with pride all prepossession, wounded the vanity of everybody, laughed at prejudices, braved hatred, and condemned the slow and embarrassed pace of government. If the Directory happened to remonstrate with him, instead of appearing offended, he developed his ideas and plans with so much clearness, care, and eloquence that no objection was possible. And 2 hours afterwards, all he proposed was executed. But if the Directory was tired of Bonaparte, the general was no less so of Paris life, which afforded no career to his ambition, no field for his genius. He had a long time before formed a plan for the conquest of Italy. Long service in the army of Nice had procured him the necessary leisure to mature his designs, to calculate all their difficulties and guess all their chances. He solicited of government the command of that army with money and troops. He was made general-in-chief. He got troops, but only the small sum of 100,000 crowns. With those scanty means, he was to conquer Italy at the head of troops who had received no pay for the last 6 months and who had not even shoes to their feet. But Bonaparte felt the consciousness of his strength, and looking forward with delight to the future, he took leave of the Directory, who saw his departure with secret pleasure, happy to be rid of a man whose character awed them and whose projects were, in the eyes of the majority of its members, nothing more than the wild fancies of a youth full of pride and presumption. General Dillier had been dismissed on the 13th Vendémiaire for having expressed himself in strong terms against that expedition. He went to General Bonaparte, who procured him a fresh appointment, and he was sent as chief of the staff to the right division of the Western Army, whose headquarters were at Alençon. The war in the Vendée was brought to an end through fatigue and want of food. The consequences of the passage of the Loire had been too fatal to the Vendéens to leave them in a situation to prolong the contest. Their most able leaders were killed. The grandchildren of Henry IV had disdained to appear among those gallant soldiers who fought without regimentals, without order, and whose appearance had not the sometimes useless brilliancy of regular troops. Charette, the only man who might have supported his part, had been shot at Nantes by order of the government, who would have acted more honorably in granting him his pardon. And the unfortunate attempt at Quiberon had struck the last blow to the enthusiasm and hopes of the rebels. Scattered bands, acting without any decided aim, still ravaged some parts of the country. General Hoche, to whom the command of the western departments was entrusted, succeeded in a short time, by his wisdom, moderation, and resolution, in destroying the last remains of civil war. He established a system of movable columns whose motions were calculated with so much precision that while they were continually crossing the country in all directions, they frequently met and were enabled to support one another in case they should be attacked by superior forces. The enemy, thus chased, unable to enjoy one moment's rest or safety, got discouraged and at last preferred to exertions without aim a peace which ensured him the free exercise of those religious duties for which he had taken up arms, and the hope of better times. In Normandy, where I was, war was raging without glory, but not without peril. The Chouans, secured against surprise behind their high hedges, aimed close upon us and cost us a great number of men. When they wanted to replenish their military chest, they stopped the stagecoaches, stripped the travelers, and frequently killed them. These gentlemen fancied that their title of royalists ennobled even their profession of robbers. A little while before our arrival, a general and well-directed bush-beating had taken place against them, and had disgusted them at a profession which left them no other prospect than the punishment due to highway robbers. Count Frottet, who commanded those noble troops, gave his companions leave to make their peace, and went over to England, after having, as it was reported, broken his word. The principal leaders then wrote to General Montigny, who commanded the division, to solicit an interview which took place at the castle of Louvet near Alençon. I went to meet these gentlemen into a wood near the castle. I was conducted there blindfolded, and after a quarter of an hour's walk, I found in a thicket a dozen tattered wretches lying on the grass, exhausted from fatigue and want. Some of them were remarkable for a haughty expression of countenance, which they did not belie during the conference. Their submission was unreserved. Several among them were obliged to leave the scene of their achievements. Others joined the armies of the Republic. When the treaty was signed, we all stepped into a room where a splendid breakfast was prepared. There were 20 of us standing around the table and looking at one another in silence. General Montigny invited them to sit down. An unequivocal motion of the head was all the answer they gave. Cold ceremonies were exchanged, after which we all mounted our horses and separated. One of the conditions of the treaty was that the leaders of the troops should recover the unsold part of their property, as those of the Vendéan army had already done. This favor was justly due, not only to their valor and exertions, but also to their patriotic sentiments, which had made them prefer the dangers of civil war to the disgrace of serving under foreign banners. Now that the emigrants are happy in the enjoyment of the rank and confidence of the sovereign that allows them, one may speak freely on their account. The first impulse which urged them to fly cannot be blamed. But how can one justify the disgraceful resolution of placing themselves in the pay of the enemies of their country? The revolution was a family quarrel from which foreign nations ought by all means to have been excluded. What was to be expected of the Austrians, the Prussians, or the English, but the subjection of France, her dismemberment and disgrace? The Vendéans also fought to maintain their religion and the monarchy, but far from giving themselves up to a foreign enemy, they never would suffer English troops to come to their support. They had not forgotten that Henry IV was obliged to take German troopers into his pay, but that his magnanimous soul would have recoiled at the thought of receiving pay of the Germans. The cause of the Vendéans thus defended was respectable. They certainly could not hope to get the better of the determined will of a whole nation resolved to be free, and who could not be so under the government of the Bourbons. But at least they were Frenchmen, and the troops who fought against them experienced a feeling of pride at the sight of French peasants opposing them with more courage and firmness than all the kings of Europe united together. This war against the Chouans was not more pleasing to General Dillier than to myself. He did not wait for the pacification to solicit of General Bonaparte the honor of serving under his orders. The letters of appointment soon arrived. Monsieur Dillier set off post for Italy. I was obliged to travel on horseback. The name of Bonaparte greeted my ears in every place through which I passed. Each day brought in the account of some new victory. His letters to government, his proclamations, so elevated in style and so wonderfully eloquent, roused all minds. All France shared the enthusiasm of the army for so much glory, for such brilliant and numerous triumphs. The words Montenotte, Millesimo, Lodi, Milan, Castiglione were repeated with a noble pride next to those of Jemmapes, Fleurus, and Valmy. When I arrived at Milan, the victory of Castiglione had just been gained. General Wurmser, beaten, was flying in the direction of Mantua, and after having come to force us to raise the siege of that city, he was himself obliged to seek a refuge within its walls. I was convinced that General Dillier was to be employed in military service, and during the journey I indulged in glittering dreams of glory and advancement. How great was now my consternation when I found him governor of Lombardy. I was going to be buried again in the paper business of a staff, sentenced to distribute the bulletins of our victories, to be busy about the 1,000 minutiae of an office so tiresome to a soldier, and at last not even dare to acknowledge that I had been in the army of Italy, of which I should share neither the perils nor the triumphs. Besides, my sword was my only fortune, and could I hope for advancement when I had not deserved any? These thoughts grieved me sorely and made me adopt the resolution of soliciting the command of a troop of infantry in a brigade of the vanguard. General Dillier attempted in vain to make me alter my mind, forced at last to yield to my entreaties. He was about to give me my orders when the intelligence of the victory of Arcola arrived at Milan. 2 aides-de-camp of the general-in-chief had been killed. Muiron, an officer of the artillery for whom he entertained a great regard, of which his good qualities made him worthy, and young Elliot, a nephew of General Clark. Monsieur Dillier spoke of me to General Bonaparte with great warmth and got me appointed to succeed Muiron. My first sensation was joy at this unexpected favor of fortune, but it was soon troubled by the fear of being severely judged by one so well able to scan my merits. My uneasiness was such as to make me regret the success General Dillier had obtained. I went to the general-in-chief, who lodged in the Palazzo Cirbelloni. He was giving audience. His saloon was filled with military men of all ranks and high civil officers. His air was affable, but his look so firm and fixed that I turned pale when he addressed himself to me. I faltered out my name, and afterwards my thanks, to which he listened in silence, his eyes fastening on me with an expression of severity that quite disconcerted me. At last he said, "Come back at 6 o'clock and put on the sash." That sash, which distinguished the aides-de-camp of the general-in-chief, was of white and red silk and was worn around the left arm. When I went back to the palace at the appointed hour, the officer on duty introduced me into the saloon of the aides-de-camp. This was a new subject of perplexity. I was not acquainted with any of them. They could see by my sash that I was a new comrade, but not one came up to me. They communicated their observations to one another, directing towards my person looks that did not seem to me very favorable, until Marmont came in, and perceiving me, took me by the hand and said, "Here is a new comrade, who will soon be a friend." "In the field of battle," I answered with a blush, "I shall be less embarrassed than I am here." A few days were sufficient to establish between us a degree of friendship that has never diminished. The aides-de-camp of the general-in-chief were at that time 8 in number. Murat, who had been named general of brigade, was no longer one of them. The first was Colonel Junot, afterwards Duc d'Abrantes. He was born in Burgundy and enlisted as a private soldier in a company of volunteer cannoneers in the department. At the siege of Toulon, he was admired for an instance of intrepidity that has seldom occurred since. The famous redoubt called Les Sans-Culottes, defended by the English, had been attacked for several hours, but its fire was still very troublesome to us. General Bonaparte ordered a battalion to take it by storm. Although Junot did not belong to that battalion, he rushed first of all into the ditch, climbed up the scarp, jumped into the redoubt through a battlement, killed 2 cannoneers at their post, and by that means gave his companions time to join him. The redoubt was taken amidst cries of "The Republic forever!" General Bonaparte made him sergeant, and his handwriting being clear and neat, he made use of him as a secretary during the remainder of the campaign. When I met him for the first time, he was a colonel and had been wounded at the Battle of Castiglione. Junot added to the great courage much natural shrewdness. After having served during 20 years and passed through all military ranks, he ended his life in a deplorable manner. The cold he suffered in the Russian campaign disordered his mental faculties. The unhappy man died under his paternal roof. His reason returned a short time before he breathed his last. And seeing himself again in the humble chamber in which he had passed his youth, he was enabled justly to appreciate his glittering dream of fortune and glory. Marmont, a colonel of artillery, was also born in Burgundy, of an ancient and respectable family in that province. His education had been particularly well attended to, and he had entered very young into the army. The principal features of his character were at that time an unbounded passion for glory and ambition, and an attachment to his general that amounted to enthusiasm. Duroc was the third aide-de-camp. Though less brilliant than the 2 former, he possessed greater solidity of judgment and a remarkable tenaciousness of character. In 1789, he was an officer of the artillery. He had emigrated, but had speedily returned to France. The general-in-chief was much attached to him. Duroc was grateful, and I believe his fidelity would have nobly borne the dangerous ideal of a revolution of 1814. The 4th aide-de-camp was Le Marois, a young man scarcely 17 years old and already covered with wounds. After him came Sulkowski, a true Pole of chivalrous valor, passionately fond of adventures, with a romantic and restless mind, well informed and speaking fluently all the languages of Europe. When almost a child, he had fought for the liberty of his country. Wounded at the siege of Warsaw and compelled to fly, he came to France. He was soon after sent to Constantinople with Monsieur de Scorch, our ambassador. The Committee of Public Safety wished to have an agent in India. Sulkowski, undertook that mission. He had already passed Aleppo, where the English discovered him and got some Arabs to rob him of his papers. Having escaped out of their hands, he returned to Paris and obtained an appointment in the army of Italy. He was engaged at the siege of Mantua when a report that he had addressed to the chief of the staff fell under the eyes of the general-in-chief, and the following day he was made his aide-de-camp. We had also among us Louis Bonaparte, then scarcely 16 years of age, and whom his brothers spared no more than the rest of us on the most perilous missions. Louis fulfilled them with a satisfaction which proved him worthy of his name, Eliot having been killed, as I mentioned above. And General-in-Chief took in his place Croissier, a brave and clever officer of cavalry.